Chapter 13, The Nation Grows. So we're going to be talking about how the early years of the United States and kind of the progression of how things got to the point between the War of Independence and the Civil War. So that's the period we're focusing on right now. So right now we're talking about how the nation grew overall, and in particular the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution was basically a major time period when things were being transitioned from everything being made by hand individually to machines, shortening the amount of time and lessening the amount of labor that was involved. It's called the Industrial Revolution, and it was primarily at the start used water power, but then eventually and primarily in cloth factories, sometimes called textile factories, and eventually it moved to using steam power. Now, the first American factory was one that basically stole technology from England, and it was a textile factory. And you can see here, if you look here, we've got this a water wheel, and basically the water pushes this wheel, and there is basically this piece here. A bunch of different machines are attached to it, and that rotates inside the mill, and then that leads them to get power from there, and that's basically how they power the whole plant. Now, Samuel Slater was the guy who was the first American to have this because he had worked in an English textile factory, and he memorized how it was set up, and then he was hired when he came over here in Rhode Island to build a factory, and then others followed and did other things like he'd done as well and expanded it greatly. This invention here, the cotton gin, was one of the most inventions in one of the most important inventions in U.S. history, simply because it is what made slavery really, really profitable, or at least in the later part of the 19th century, or the middle part of the 19th century. This is what made money. Because this is what allowed slaves to pick cotton, and picking cotton is a really labor-intensive thing because you have to get the seeds out and in order to make it into fabric or make it into thread. And this made it so you didn't, made it a lot easier because all you'd do is you would spin this handle, put the cotton straight that you picked off, and then it would take the seeds directly out and put them up here, and then you'd end up with the actual clean cotton. And it made it so that you could grow cotton in a lot of places where you couldn't grow food, so you could grow cotton in other places in the South, and it really made slavery a lot more important. There were some people who thought slavery might die out, but not when cotton became something that was able to be easily made. And machines really did change our nation. And in terms of Eli Whitney, he was the guy who came up with the cotton gin. And he also pioneered the idea of interchangeable parts, which if you bought a rifle from someone, what would happen would be is the rifle would be put together by one individual and all the pieces fit exactly right. That's great, but if something broke, you'd have to buy a new rifle. Eli Whitney pioneered this idea of having pieces where you could interchange them to make them easier to fit. And manufacturing was cheaper because you could fit the piece together, or at least the cost of the product was cheaper as well. But it also made it so workers could be paid less because they'd only have to know one part of the job. And this is kind of something that happens later on in terms of people having to do less and less, or more and more of one particular job that didn't cover everything. Like in Henry Ford's auto plant, so they would just tighten one bolt on the factory line instead of putting together a whole car. The factory system, some of these factories started to do all steps in one business. Like the first one this happened in was in Lowell, Massachusetts, textile factory. Yeah, again, textiles. And in Lowell, basically this guy went ahead and hired women who would work for 12 to 14 hours a day at the mills. And they would take the cloth, they would turn it into thread, they'd then thread it into cloth, and then they'd cut pieces out into clothing or whatever it was going to be. And they did this for a long period of time. It was quite profitable for the factory owners. And it actually was an okay deal for a lot of the what they were called mill girls, because they got paid more than they were on the farms, but still it was not a fun or particularly safe life in some cases, depending upon which factory you worked in. In terms of machines for farming, very important machines were developed. One of them was Cyrus McCormick's Reaper, and if you can see here, you would drive over an area with this machinery, and it would automatically cut the pieces of the wheat or whatever you had, and that was a much easier way than actually having to do it by hand or with an actual scythe by hand. John Deere made a steel plow that could cut through the really tough roots around the prairie and made it a lot easier to farm there. And so that was also expanded opportunities for settling out there. In terms of new ways to travel, it took a very long time to travel since there weren't many good roads. The U.S. government built a good road, a national road is what it was called, linking Maryland to Missouri. And you can see where it went there because it was expensive, and again, there were toll roads and things like that that people would maintain. But these are the early years of transportation in our country. Really important, hugely, is the innovation of steam power. That helped a lot, specifically in transportation, but in other areas as well. Most transportation used rivers since it was cheaper and easier to transport lots of stuff that weighed a lot. Because, again, floating something and then pulling it takes a lot less energy than carrying it around with oxen or whatever. Robert Fulton developed the first steamboat, and that was the Claremont, and this is a picture of that. And what would happen is this wheel would, when needed, it would provide paddling, and then you could go upriver pretty easily. And it was amazing the amount of time it cut days and days off of transportation in terms of the amount of time it would take you to actually go a place. And really that was just, and you could go upriver much easier. In terms of the Erie Canal, that was the canal that basically went ahead and connected New York with the Mississippi River. Because DeWitt Clinton, he was the governor of New York, he came up with this idea. And if you look here, this here is Lake Erie. That's Lake Ontario up there. By the way, if you're curious, Niagara Falls is somewhere in there, and I looked that up. But the digging of this canal made it so that if you can get to Lake Erie, you can get to Chicago through the other Great Lakes. And if you get to Chicago, you can get to the Mississippi River because of the different portages that were there. So really, if you can get to Lake Erie, and then they dug out this canal, hundreds of miles of territory. It took a long time, but when they dug it, they ended up going ahead and making it so they could hook up with this river here and then go right down the river to New York City. And the Erie Canal, one of the things that's really important to understand is that it's about 500 feet higher up by Erie than it is down where it connects up in New York, or in the area of New York where it connects up with that river. So what they had to do is they had to go ahead and have locks. And a lock is basically you close up this piece here, and then you have water float in. And when the water flows in, it rises the barge, whatever's transporting it. And you can see this in Chicago as well. It happens there as well. And then you can open up another lock on the other side, and the ship can travel through that other lock. And it's like going up steps very slowly. But it was a way of making it so that you could travel 500 feet up, over 500 feet up over about 650 miles of territory. So it was a steep rise, but still was pretty impressive, and that also is reused in a place like Panama as well. Locomotives, really important. Again, this allowed transportation everywhere. Huge innovation allowed transportation without being close to rivers. This is a famous picture, or a famous supposed race between a horse and an early railroad called Tom Thumb. Really small railroad engine, but the horse ended up winning because Tom Thumb sort of broke down, but it was famous. And obviously, eventually, the railroads won out after all. In terms of railroads, it started off small, little lines, and then over time, expanded out by 1860 all over the place, particularly in the north. And that's going to come back to be very important in the Civil War, because it allowed them to have easier transportation as well than the south.